We often hear about information overload, but this is something else. How can one place, Portland, Oregon, be called both war-ravaged on, let's say, the national stage, and also small and sedate by people actually there?
It's a fascinating clash, isn't it? And that exact gap, that huge difference between the rhetoric and what locals were reporting, well, that's what set off this major legal fight over using the military domestically.
Right. When those narratives collide so hard, the courts kind of have to step in.
Exactly. They have to figure out which version of reality holds up under scrutiny.
So our mission today is to really unpack that. We've gone through a lot of sources covering this whole legal and political drama around the attempt to send the National Guard into Portland. This wasn't just political posturing.
No, not at all. This was fundamental. It touched on states' rights, constitutional limits, big stuff.
And the absolute core of it, what we're focusing on, is that moment a federal judge stepped in. Specifically, U.S. District Judge Corinna Emmerich. She put a temporary stop to President Trump deploying, what was it, 200 Oregon National Guard troops. That was Saturday, October 4th.
That's the one. A temporary restraining order, basically hitting pause on the whole deployment.
And here's the detail that really jumps out, the thing that makes you pause and think, okay, this isn't just party politics. Judge Emmerich, she's a Trump appointee, a Republican judge appointed by the very president trying to send in the troops.
Yeah, that detail's crucial. It immediately shifts the focus, doesn't it? From like an ideological battle to the actual legal arguments and the facts on the ground.
Exactly.
When a judge appointed by the administration rules against that same administration's action, it strongly suggests the case presented by Oregon, that the factual evidence, was just that compelling. It had to override any political alignment.
So it becomes less about politics and more about evidence versus executive assertion, like a reality check.
Precisely. A finding that, look, the facts presented just don't meet the threshold for this kind of federal emergency action.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. Lay out the timeline for us. What was the official reason given by the administration for wanting to deploy the Guard? Why Portland? Why then?
Well, the justification came straight from the president via Truth Social on September 27th. He said he directed the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, to send troops.
And a specific reason.
To protect federal immigration facilities, IC facilities. The claim was they were, and I'm quoting here, under siege from attack by Antifa and other domestic terrorists.
Under siege. Domestic terrorists. That's very strong language. It paints a picture of, well, chaos.
Yeah.
And he didn't just ask for help. He authorized force, right?
Yes, explicitly. The authorization was to use full force if necessary. That phrasing is key. It signals this wasn't just about, having some extra bodies around for support.
Implies a combat footing, potentially.
It certainly raises the stakes. The idea of full force being used against American citizens on American soil, well, that's what triggered such a rapid response from the state.
You can see why Oregon would react quickly.
Absolutely. That post went up and the clock started ticking. They knew deployment could happen fast.
And Oregon's legal team didn't wait around. The sources show they moved incredibly fast.
They did. The lawsuit was filed by the Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield's office on September 28th. That's just one day, 24 hours after the president's statement.
Wow.
They clearly understood that getting ahead of it, challenging the factual basis before troops arrived, was probably their only shot at stopping it.
Which brings us to what I think is the most interesting part. This clash of realities, the battle of perceptions, you could call it. How did Oregon push back against that narrative of a city supposedly overrun?
They countered with data, hard facts, specificity. They basically told the federal officials, under oath in their filings, that the description was wrong. They said the protests happening then were small and sedate.
Small and sedate. That's quite different from under siege.
Completely different, and they had numbers to back it up.
Okay, so what were the key facts? What convinced Judge Emmerich, a conservative judge, that the state had a point?
It really came down to the arrest data, or rather, the lack of it. Oregon pointed out there were only 25 arrests way back in mid-June, months earlier.
Months before this deployment attempt.
Right, and even more critically, they showed there had been 0 arrests related to these specific ICE protests in the 3.5 months since June 19th. 0.
0 arrests in over 3 months. That really makes it hard to argue there's an ongoing violent siege requiring military intervention.
It completely undermines it in a legal context. How can you claim an emergency situation requires full force when the official records show nothing?
Statistical quiet, as you put it.
Yeah, that data is incredibly powerful in court.
And it wasn't just statistics. Local voices painted a similar picture. Caroline Turco, an attorney in Portland, she pointed out there hadn't been any violence against ICE officers for months.
And the protests themselves.
Sometimes, she said, fewer than a dozen people showed up. Hardly an overwhelming force.
That quote from Turco you mentioned, it really nails the disconnect. Can you share that again?
Sure. She said, the president's perception of what is happening in Portland is not the reality on the ground. And then she contrasted his view, which she characterized as like World War II, with the actual situation. A beautiful city with a sophisticated police force that can handle the situation.
World War II versus a manageable local issue. That says it all.
It really draws the line between policy potentially driven by, let's say, dramatic imagery versus policy based on current facts. And Oregon's lawyers actually had a theory about why the federal perception might have been so skewed.
Ah, the media angle. This is where it gets into how information or maybe misinformation can filter up.
Exactly. Oregon argued in court that this whole deployment push seemed to happen right after Fox News had been showing video clips. But clips from 2020.
From the much larger, more intense protests back then.
Precisely. Substantially larger and more turbulent protests, as the filing put it. So the suggestion was that the decision wasn't based on current intelligence about an immediate threat, but maybe on watching replays of past events.
That's quite something. Justifying potential military action based on old news clips. It raises serious questions about how policy gets made. And the state's political leadership, Governor Kotek, she pushed back too.
Oh, absolutely. Governor Tina Kotek, a Democrat, was very firm. She said she told the administration directly, including Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, that Oregon didn't need or want the help.
What was her reasoning?
She made it abundantly clear, was her phrase, that the city and state can manage our own local public safety needs. It wasn't just a political disagreement. It was an assertion of state sovereignty. Basically, we've got this, stay out.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? This Portland situation fits into a broader context.
Definitely. This was just the latest example, maybe the most legally successful challenge, but part of a pattern. There were similar discussions about deploying federal forces or National Guard under federal control to other Democrat-led cities, like Los Angeles.
And wasn't there already a deployment in D.C.?
Yes, earlier that summer. Around 800 National Guard troops were deployed to Washington, D.C. on August 11th. That was under a declared public safety emergency. So there was a recent precedent for the administration taking this kind of action.
But not every state just went along with it. Illinois, for instance, offered pretty strong resistance, didn't it?
Fierce resistance. That was a really interesting case. The administration told Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker they planned to federalize 300 members of the Illinois National Guard.
Federalized. That's different from just deploying, right? It means taking control away from the state.
Exactly. It means the president, not the governor, commands those troops. It essentially overrides the governor's authority over their own state militia. That's a huge constitutional step.
And Pritzker's response. He didn't just object legally like Oregon did. He took a strong political stance.
He drew a line in the sand. His statement was incredibly direct. He said he would defy the suggestion. He wouldn't call up the Guard, quote, to further Trump's acts of aggression against our people.
Wow. Acts of aggression against our people. Using that language against the federal government. That's extraordinary.
It completely reframes the situation. He's not saying we don't need help. He's saying you are treating my citizens like adversaries. It makes it a fundamental conflict over the military's role domestically.
So he wasn't just questioning the need, he was questioning the motive.
Yes. He explicitly framed it as upholding the Constitution and the rule of law. He argued that using the Guard like this wasn't about actual public safety needs, which he maintained Illinois could handle, but about political intimidation.
So you have Oregon winning in court based on facts, and Illinois pushing back hard on political and constitutional grounds.
Right. Both asserting state control and capability, but using different avenues of resistance. It paints a picture of significant pushback against this federal approach.
And it wasn't just Democratic governors, right? Judge Emerget, being a Republican appointee, underscores that.
That's key. It suggests the concerns weren't purely partisan, but rooted in assessments of the actual situation on the ground versus the federal narrative, and perhaps constitutional boundaries, too.
So if we pull this all together, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the core tension is really clear. It's this friction between a perception of national emergency, often amplified by media or political rhetoric coming from the executive branch, versus the assertions by governors and local officials, backed by data, that they can handle their own public safety within constitutional norms.
It forces a kind of showdown over whose reality counts.
Exactly. And it becomes a check on executive power, forcing the federal government to actually demonstrate the emergency is real and justifies overriding state authority.
And for you, the listener, the key thing to remember from the Portland case is how it ended, at least temporarily. A judge, appointed by the president himself, looked at the facts presented by the state, the 0 arrests, the small protests, and agreed that the reality on the ground just didn't match the federal narrative of chaos.
The facts won out over the rhetoric in court. That's the bottom line there. The state successfully showed the emperor, so to speak, had no clothes, or at least not the ones being described.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you to consider. Both the court case in Oregon and that political standoff in Illinois revolved around this gap between what was being said nationally
Yep.
and what was actually happening locally.
Right. So the question to think about is this. What happens? What are the potential long-term risks to, say, democratic norms or governance when the perception of violence, especially a perception maybe fueled by selective media clips of past events, becomes the main reason for deploying military force inside our own country, potentially overriding the documented reality presented by local officials?
The heavy question, definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.